Good morning, everybody, or good evening, as the case may be, if you're in the United States listening to another United States Study Centre webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name's Simon Jackman. I'm Professor of Political Science at the University of Sydney and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre. And the United States Study Centre and the University of Sydney stand on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm so thrilled by the fact that we've got Phil Rucker, who is Bureau Chief, White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, joining us from Washington, where it's the Monday night of Memorial Day weekend. And thank you, Phil, for putting on a tie and jacket on a Monday night, which is not that dissimilar from what you often do this time of the evening on a weeknight. Phil, of course, in addition to being White House Bureau Chief at the Post, is a contributor on NBC and MSNBC, which if you look at just the right places of the internet, you can see Phil a frequent contributor to MSNBC's evening coverage after a hard day at the White House, breaking news and going on to further the story on MSNBC. Phil, of course, though, is the author of a book, co-author of a book with Carol Leonig. I hope I'm pronouncing Carol's name correctly. But a very stable genius. And the subtitle's significant, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. Phil and a team of Post reporters are winners of the Pulitzer, America's most prestigious award for journalism, and the George Polk Award for their reporting on Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Phil's been at the Post now since 2005 and has covered all sorts of ends of American politics, Congress, the Obama White House, and both the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns. And he is a graduate of Yale University in history, where he got to know our own Charles Edel, who has an insignificant role in bringing us Phil today. Phil, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's great to be with you all. It's a little bittersweet because Carol and I were both scheduled to be at the Sydney Writers' Festival in May and taking a tour through Australia to talk about our book, and unfortunately those plans got scrapped. As I know, everybody else's travel plans are scrapped, but here we are in quarantine, and with the magic of technology, we're able to have this interesting discussion from a world away. So I'm really grateful to be here and glad for everyone who's taking the time to listen and participate.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Phil. We knew you were supposed to be out here for the Writers' Festival. But we're delighted to be able to do this, and indeed, yeah, turning adversity into a virtue. Reaching out to people such as yourself, really amazing that technology allows us to do that. Phil, I wonder, before we get into the substance, I just feel it would be appropriate to briefly reflect on the fact that the United States is coming up on a spectacularly grim milestone of potentially sometime this week. Expectations are that the fatality count in the United States will reach 100,000. And you're there in Washington, D.C., which remains a very active center for the virus and its transmission. It was Memorial Day weekend there in the United States. Many Americans, expatriates living here in Australia, but many Australians in themselves know what a significant holiday that is in the United States, the official start of summer. I'm wondering, before we get into the politics and the book, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a few reflections on life in DC at the moment, particularly on this Memorial Day of 2020.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. You know, Washington, D.C. is a metro area, not as big as New York, but we happen to be currently among the top metro areas in the country for the spread of coronavirus. The city remains largely on lockdown. schools, businesses, other gathering places are shut. And Memorial Day weekend here, as across America, is a time when a lot of people get together and have barbecues and spend time outdoors with their families, and a lot of big gatherings. And we just didn't see that this weekend. It's really quite sad. I took a couple hours to walk through Rock Creek Park, which, if you're familiar with Washington,
Right.
is the beautiful park that
Right.
divides the city. And there were all kinds of people there having picnics, but social distancing, at 6 or 8
Right.
feet apart on their picnic blankets. And it was quite a sight. I've never seen it quite like that. But we're, making it through, and hopefully the numbers will go down. The milestone of 100,000 deaths is really significant. This is a number that the president himself,
Right.
said repeatedly he didn't think we would ever reach. Certainly there are experts who believe if we'd taken some stronger measures earlier, as Australia did, for example, we would not be near this grim milestone. But here we are. We're probably going to hit 100,000 this week. It will probably continue to climb over the next several months as the virus continues to spread in this country. And it's worth also keeping in mind that public health experts, epidemiologists believe that that's not the real death total, that there were many deaths from COVID-19 that have not been counted as deaths from COVID-19. So we very well may have lost more than 100,000 Americans so far. We just don't have that raw number right now.
Right. Grim times, but with massive political consequences that we'll get into presently, Phil. I want to go to the book though, and I'll hold it up one more time. There it is.
Keep holding it.
A very stable genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing for America, and just just the way you take us back through that recent history, the way that, books written by workaday journalists, people who are there filing the stories day by day. There's all, the first draft of history and all that, but it's all there in great detail. But I want to talk about the frame that you've put around it with the incredibly provocative title, the president's own words. And Phil, this is something we get asked about all the time. I'm sure you do too in the United States, but at the United States Study Center here in Australia, is Trump a genius? Now, I don't know that he's a genius in the sense if you could hand him a Rubik's Cube and he'd solve it in 90, that's sort of the word, but of the word genius. But in the early going of your book, you cite 2 associates of the president who interrogate that proposition at least. And my own take on it is he's perhaps not a mathematical genius, but he is the first person since Dwight Eisenhower to be elected president of the United States without having held prior elected office. And recall that Dwight Eisenhower had a pretty impressive CV by 1952. He blasted the rest of the Republican field off stage, including senators and Republican Party royalty. He took over the Republican Party. He made use of social media better than the Democrats, who are meant to be the teched up party after the Obama for America campaigns and the amount of money Hillary Clinton had to spend. He wins the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote by 2 percentage points. And I think most importantly, through his presidency, he's just driven the media agenda in a way that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. So is there some 3-dimensional chess game or some master game of Go being played here, or is it just mad improvisation from a guy and a team who didn't expect to win? Where do you land on that one, Phil?
Yeah, that's a lot there. I would start by answering the last part of your question there, which is, I don't see this as a 3-dimensional chess game. There's no grand strategy at play here with President Trump. It's sort of an improvisational move from day to day to day, where the president is making decisions based on his instincts and his whims and based on the media cycle all around him. And in some days, it feels like a sort of hour by hour quest for political survival. He just wants to live to the next news cycle and try to win in the short term without a ton of foresight that goes into the broader strategy. Now, he certainly has some genius characteristics, and you pointed out some of them. His political instincts are incredible, or at least had been within the Republican Party. I think it's a real test whether that's going to hold up this November in the general election. He is behind in virtually every poll. But he also has a real unique ability to communicate and galvanize his core supporters day in and day out, to understand what they want to hear from him and then to deliver it and to satisfy them. And I would say that's a genius characteristic. But we chose this title. This is, of course, the president's own description for himself, a very stable genius. It's something he first said back his first year of the presidency, when there were a lot of doubts. There was a national discussion underway about his psychological fitness for office, whether he had the mental acuity required to be the commander-in-chief. And he defended himself by saying, I'm a very stable genius. And what Carol and I found, we wanted to use this title to stress test his own definition against the accounts of the 200 administration officials and other advisors and friends we interviewed for the book. And almost all of them made clear to us that he is neither stable nor a genius. Okay. He is erratic in his state. We see that every day just looking at his Twitter feed. But he also doesn't have a lot of knowledge. He has very little expertise about the subjects he's making decisions on. And we can get into this later in the discussion, but he does not have an aptitude for retaining information from his briefings, or really a patience to sit through them. So he's much more making gut decisions based on the media environment than based on cold, concrete fact.
Right. And I guess we'll get to this a little bit later too. So while perhaps a great sort of attributes to run as an insurgent outsider, perhaps not best suited for governing, and the point we'll come to later, perhaps, Phil, running as an incumbent seeking re-election and managing the greatest public health crisis potentially in the century, was certainly in the century, and perhaps even bigger.
And the greatest economic crisis in the past century. So he's got 3 crises on his hands right now.
And I guess that almost answers the next question I wanted to put to you, Phil. But when you wrote the book, and that's to do with the subtitle, the testing of America. When you wrote the book, COVID-19, we weren't talking about, right? The book really takes us up to the end of the Mueller investigation. And the next day, of course, the Ukraine adventure starts. But COVID-19 and its economic fallout were not on the table. And clearly, I think they are tests for the president. But I want to just extract away just a little bit, Phil, give the opportunity to swing for the bleachers here a little bit. And that is, the book is very much blow by blow, appointment by appointment, an incredibly detailed chronicling of, the transgressive nature of Trump, the way he confounds expectations about the way presidents ought to behave, interact with leaders, Congress, their staff, journalists. But just extracting back from that, what exactly for the Republic is being tested by Trump? What is at stake in this test?
Virtually everything is being tested and has been tested by this presidency. Our morality and values as Americans have been tested by his rhetoric, by the way he chooses to pit different constituencies and different groups of people against each other. The democracy itself is being tested by the way he is going after institutions like the Department of Justice, by the way he's expanding his view and role of presidential power. The world order that America helped build nearly a century ago and has maintained over all these years is being tested by the way the president is discarding with traditional alliances and making new ones, and reaching out to dictators and forming a friendship with Kim Jong-un, for example. And so many other aspects of American life and American sort of civic life has been tested by this president and continues to be tested. I mean, he's even waging war on truth and fact and reality, and creating for his supporters an alternative reality to some degree, where the facts are different, and you see that on Fox News Channel and in other social media realms, where the president will declare something and it is so, even though it doesn't hold up to the truth. and that is also testing America. So there are tests in many ways, and that's why we chose that subtitle, of course.
So next question, Phil, is America passing the test?
I think that's not for me to decide. We've got an important election coming up in November, and I think we'll all be able to evaluate after that election whether how America came out through this test. I mean, are the changes that Trump has tried to put in place in this country accepted by the majority of our voters? We're going to have to see. It's their choice. I mean, Americans chose to have him as the president 4 years ago, and if he gets a second term, I think a lot of the norm busting, a lot of the changes to our life and structure of our government could well change for the long haul, because he's going to have a mandate and have another 4 years to enact those changes.
I want to ask, is this different? I mean, I can remember during the W administration that facts don't matter, that that the Bush administration, the W is waging a war against the truth, that that with an assist from partisan media, the Republican base was being treated to a perspective of the world that, I think that was when the magic words, reality has a well-known liberal bias, it was jokingly, introduced to the American sort of commentariat. What's different this time in your view?
I don't want to dismiss the ways in which the Bush administration misled the public, because there were some that were profound, especially around the origins of the Iraq War and WMD and all of that. But on the whole, and over the course of those 8 years, it felt like much more political spin than complete fabrication and lies, which we see day in and day out from Trump and his White House. And there was no such thing during the Bush years as the Washington Post fact checker chronicling all the misstatements and lies of the president, but there is now, and Trump has hit an extraordinary number.
I want to sort of talk about, I mean, for Australians that don't know it, and Mara and team here in Sydney, if we could flip to the third slide deck, the third slide in the deck there, just some screenshots of two of Phil's recent big stories, and in particular where Phil has put a question to the president where the answer went on to lead global news, frankly, for the next days, if not weeks. And of course, it was Phil that asked the question in the White House briefing room that led to Trump then riffing and finally getting to this observation or the speculation about the medical virtues of detergent and ultraviolet light inside people's bodies. And then more recently, again, a question from Phil to the president about what exactly are the crimes that constitute Obamagate. And if we could just drop that slide now and come back to us, Mara, thanks. That's great. Phil, I just want to ask, Trump, in response to those questions, certainly the second one, comes after you and the paper and the Post personally, in pretty nasty terms. He calls journalists nasty, he calls them rude, he's called journalists enemies of the people. I just want to ask a personal question, first of all. How are you dealing with that? I mean, I can't help but think someone as visible as yourself going up against the president of the United States with 50 million, whatever it is, Twitter followers, it must have an impact on your day-to-day life and those of your colleagues as well.
It does. It doesn't really matter how I feel about it personally, because I feel like I have a job to do and am doing that. It's not pleasant. You don't want to have the president calling you names. And by the way, the list of names he's called me goes longer than what you just said. He's had any number of insults over the years, and he has with other reporters as well. And at this point, it's just, it kind of comes with the territory and is a part of the job, and I've adapted and I'm used to it. But it's unsettling and it's ugly. And, you know, when he tags you on Twitter, my mentions are ugly, and you just don't want to look at what people are saying back for the next 48, 72 hours. We've had security issues where the Washington Post has had to try to, you know, find ways to protect me from some threats from Trump supporters on email. And it's just a very ugly environment to be a journalist in this country covering this president. I should point out, by the way, he's particularly disgusting in his treatment of women journalists.
Yeah.
He has gone after women, and in particular, a few women of color in a really ugly way.
Yeah, quite recently.
And turned his supporters on them. But, you know, this is all part of a political strategy for Trump. He wants to have a war with the media. He wants to create a foil out of us. And actually, when the cameras are not off, and like I've interacted with him behind the scenes, off the record, in a smaller setting, he's actually quite charming and charismatic and solicitous of my approval and cracking jokes and wanting to be my friend and my buddy. And that's how he is with other reporters too. And so much of the insult kind of nastiness is for the cameras. It's part of the show that Trump has tried to create around his White House. That's
incredible. Thanks for sharing that observation. We've heard reports of that from other journalists, but to hear it firsthand, that's remarkable. Let me ask another journalism question, though. How do you, perhaps personally, as a bureau chief, but not an op-ed columnist, right? A reporter. But perhaps the Post more institutionally, because it's something we struggle with as a study center, as a collection of scholars. How do you dispassionately, objectively analyze, or in your case, report on Trump when he's precisely so transgressive and contra to norms? Where does the line between straight reporting and commentary, analysis, or op-editing does that inevitably blur with a president who's so out of the ordinary?
You know, it always blurs a little bit, regardless of what principle or subject you're covering as a journalist. But I found that, you know, it's important to maintain objectivity, and I have in my reporting, and it's really important to be fair to Trump and to the White House. But that doesn't mean that we, do sort of the both sides game in journalism, where you have he said, she said throughout an article. I mean, we can call things as we see them. If Trump is lying, we'll say so. Right. If Trump is acting irrationally or erratically, we write about that and we say that in the top of the story in very strong and clear language. I think the difference is what I've tried to do as a reporter, as the White House bureau chief at the Post, is to describe what I see and what I know based on reporting, as opposed to forming a judgment about it, or as opposed to issuing some sort of call to action. You know, I don't have a dog in this fight. It doesn't matter to me who wins the election. I'm here to cover it, and importantly, to try to explain what's happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, what is informing the decisions that Trump is making, what are the things going on in the government that he's trying to cover up and prevent the public from knowing. And that's the pursuit every day. And his behavior, frankly, plays out in public, and we can all see with our own eyes that he's, tweeting 100 times in all kinds of crazy tweets, and we'll write about that as him having a crazy erratic moment. We're not going to, sugarcoat it in the interest of objectivity, because so much of it is so plain and so in front of us all the time.
So you just used the word both-siderism. It's a little bit of an inside baseball term.
Sorry for the jargon.
That's okay. That's okay, because I did want to bring it up. Okay. I'm just wondering, do you think, the New York Times is getting beaten up a little bit on this one, and the Post is being held out, in in a lot of commentary as less going down the road of both siderism. And is this, on the other hand, people at times will say, we're not the party of the loyal, we're not the newspaper of the loyal opposition. This is not the United Kingdom in the 19th century or early 20th century. I'm just wondering, what do you make of that debate? I know it's a distraction perhaps from getting on with the job of day-to-day journalism, but I've got to ask you, how real is that? Is this something that you and your journalistic colleagues are tracking, and it's in the back of your heads as you're doing your jobs every day? Is the Times getting beat up on? I'm just wondering if you could give us sort of your view of that debate.
Yeah, I mean, it is a real debate. You see it play out on social media all the time. I don't participate in that debate. In fact, I try to tune it out a little bit. I just do my job and try to do my stories with integrity. I will say that neither the Times nor the Washington Post are the newspapers of the resistance. We've become more popular insofar as we have more subscribers in the Trump era because people want the information that we're uncovering, but it's not because we're warriors taking on a president. That's not how we see our jobs. And I certainly hope that's not how readers and subscribers think of us. That said, that the whole issue of both siderism is alive and well and frequently debated in the public square. And I try to stay as far away from it as I can because I'm doing my job as a journalist. I'm not a media critic. And, there are professors of media who can get into all that.
Fair enough. We'll move on. Look, I want to start the turn to 2020 and the pandemic and the economic downturn as well. Look, just in the last couple of days, and perhaps it's been around for longer, but a few journalists have been using a great form of words, that Trump himself is leading the resistance to his own government, with calling on people, the liberate tweets, sort of a reprise, if you will, of the populist outsider shtick motif that helped him win in 2016. What is the Trump argument for re-election in 2020 in the face of 100,000 and quite likely more fatalities and this economic downturn from inside the White House? What will be the argument they take to the American people?
It's still developing and evolving, of course, because the argument before COVID-19 was going to be, boom, boom, boom economy, keep it going, keep the president in place. That, of course, is not an argument anymore. And the campaign pitch at the moment has almost nothing to do with the coronavirus. It's almost as if Trump wants to wipe away COVID-19, not have any discussion about the pandemic. And instead, he's focused on the economy. And the argument we hear from his team on the economy is, he built it, he'll rebuild it. It's a little bit not true because the economic recovery in America began in the Obama administration. It accelerated in the Trump administration, but Trump didn't build this economy from scratch. That said, he is claiming credit for the jobs that have been created and for the gains reached on Wall Street in these past 3 years. And his argument is, he was able to stimulate that growth in the first 3 years of his presidency. He has the skills and the policies to get America out of it. And it's coupled with another argument they're trying to make, which is that, all of the forgotten men and women, that's the phrase Trump used for the voters who turned out in 2016, the Reagan Democrats, the working class white people who had not been active in politics, he's still fighting for them. And so he's using the contrast between the public health officials in the government and sort of the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic elites in Washington, in order to drive home that message that even though he's president, even though he's sitting in the White House, even though all these people in the government report to him, he's still thinking about the little guy out there in the country and is fighting for him. All of that being said, it's an incredibly challenging environment for him. And there's no sugarcoating the reality for Trump, and he knows it, which is that he's losing right now to Joe Biden in virtually all of these battleground states that he's going to have to win. And he really needs to have a political turnaround in order to win re-election in the fall.
Yeah, I did want to, that was going to be my last question before I invite some other questions from other people we've got with us today. But Phil, just on the polls, they are pretty bleak for Trump right now. We're still 160 odd days out from the
Yeah,
election. Some reporting a couple of weeks ago that Trump erupting at his campaign manager, Brad
yeah,
Pascal, who brought in the research. And apparently it was reported, might have been you guys, I forget who reported it, but there is no effing way I'm losing to Biden, was the response of the president, apparently. Are these sort of bleak poll numbers heightening the freneticism, that crazy improvisational tempo from Trump at the moment? You have an observation on that?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, just this past weekend, the president has been uh, just all over Twitter with all kinds of conspiracy theories and attacks and insulting Jeff Sessions, his former attorney
Right.
general,
Right.
going after Biden. I mean, he seems to be just under siege and kind of all over the place. And I know from my own reporting the last few weeks that that is almost entirely because he is losing in this election and he doesn't know what to do about it. And he has no control over the pandemic. He has
Yeah.
no control over the economy, and he's just feeling very much adrift at the moment. You know, the what we're seeing happening politically and just in the last week or so is a really sharp negative turn from the Trump team. And I think that's indicative of their strategy for the general election between now and November, which is to just annihilate Biden as best they can and have a nasty, divisive campaign that really polarizes the electorate and turns off enough voters away from Biden that Trump can end up winning. We've seen him just in the last few days try to exploit a comment that Biden made about African American voters, seemingly to try to suppress the turnout of Black voters in November. And we're going to probably see that continue in the months ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot to be said about the strategy and, his hostility to vote by mail.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's enough from me for the time being. I want to invite Bruce Wolpe, non-resident fellow here at the US Study Center. We're going to run a little experiment here. This is the first time ever we've done a video question. If we could bring Bruce onto the call. Over to
That
you,
should do it.
Bruce.
All right, thank you. Phil, thanks so much again. Thank you, Simon. Phil, thanks so much again for joining us. And next time we'll have you
Thank you.
in Australia in person, which would be absolutely great.
I would love that.
I also want to say, after reading, I was privileged to review your book for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And after I read the book, I went back to All the President's Men in the Final Days to read it. And I concluded my review by saying, after reading A Very Stable Genius and then revisiting those two books, and at times in American history, it's the Washington Post and its journalism have stepped up, not to wage war against the president, but to talk about values fundamental to American democracy. And I said, after rereading those books, we have seen the likes of those reporters again, and their names are Phil Rucker and Carol Lennick. And I commend the book to everyone, and I hope this boosts some sales for you here in Australia before the week is out.
Well, thank you. It was a very generous review, and that particular line that you just cited tickled me and Carol when we saw it a few months ago. So thank you.
It's
very
great.
Nice of you.
Thank you. I want to ask, following on Simon's question, I really want to ask about Trump's stamina. I mean, here's a guy who gets up in the morning, okay, he does TV, tweets and all that, but then he can have a cabinet meeting and he's on television for 2 hours. He can have a meeting in the East Room with visiting people, and that goes for an hour, and it's all on television. Then he can get on a plane and go to Michigan and have a meeting in a plant, and that's on television. When he was doing rallies, he would talk for, when he did his briefings on COVID, 90 minutes, 2 hours at the podium. His stamina just seems amazing to me. I mean, that here's a guy who's pounding his message and taking care of his enemies like 20 hours a day. What's your sense of his stamina? Is he a stronger physically candidate than he was in 2016?
Well, I don't know. I don't know much about his physical health, but he clearly has stamina to make it through these very long public appearances, which, by the way, are longer than we're used to seeing from American presidents, or frankly from other political figures. That said, his day is very limited in its structure. I mean, most presidents would come down from the residence and arrive in the Oval Office around 8 or 9 a.m. To get their intelligence briefing and begin the day. Trump comes down around 11:30 or 12 noon. He does not have the patience for lengthy meetings. He usually spends a number of hours during the day. Once he comes down to the Oval Office, in a little private dining room just off the Oval Office, where he watches cable television on a big screen in there, and various advisors will come in and watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News with him. So, you know, we see these public appearances and he has incredible stamina to be up there on stage for so long, but it's not as if in private he's doing hour after hour of intense, serious meetings. There's a lot of leisure time in the White House. And, you know, the phrase for it is actually executive time, which is the way it's coded on the president's schedule. That's actually a scoop from an Australian reporter here, Jonathan Swan, who's been tearing it up on the White House beat. Anyhow, I don't know about his physical health, but he has incredible time at the podium, but you know, a lot of downtime as well.
Okay. My other question is on foreign policy and Putin. And I take it you don't have a scoop on, there have been 2 solo meetings that Trump has had with Putin, one in Helsinki and one in Hamburg. And it was just with translators. And in one meeting, he took the notes from the US translator and said, I'm taking these, and we don't know what happened. And I take it you don't know what, otherwise it would have been on page 1 as to what occurred there. But what is the Trump-Putin relationship, and what does Trump want out of that relationship?
Yeah, I just want to stress first how unusual it is that the American president would be meeting with the Russian president one-on-one with only a translator. You know, US presidents almost always historically have met with foreign counterparts with a number of aides there, in part to take detailed notes on behalf of the US government, in part to you know, offer guidance and input in those meetings. It is really strange for Trump to have insisted that those meetings with Putin be private, and then to tear up the translator's notes afterwards indicates that he did not want anybody in his own government, did not trust anybody in his own government to know what was discussed between them. And there have been now 2 years of commentary trying to guess what the 2 of them discussed, and we've still not figured out exactly what it was. So I won't add to that now, but I will say the relationship is really, really important and interesting. You know, Trump came into office admiring Putin, admiring his strength as a leader, admiring the fact that he's been able to remain in command of his country for so many years, and wanting to have a bromance with him, wanting for Putin to be his Margaret Thatcher, to, you know, have that, to be buddies, and went about from even before taking office trying to cultivate a friendship with Putin. In fact, in the book, A Very Stable Genius, we have a scene where Trump is at Trump Tower in New York during the transition phase. So after the election and before the inauguration, interviewing a candidate to become Secretary of State. And he sort of interrupted the candidate's train of thought and turned to his other aides in the room and said, when can I meet Putin? Can we meet with Putin before the inauguration? And he had to be told that no, that would be very inappropriate. But it just speaks to his desire to have this relationship. And you know, he admires Putin despite advisors like Rex Tillerson telling him that Putin is a former KGB operative. Putin is playing you. He's trying to manipulate you to take advantage of the United States and advance Russia's interests. And Trump doesn't want to believe that. But that is what some of his advisors in the government have tried to instill with him.
Thank you so much, Phil. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was terrific. Our experiment worked well, and those observations, Bruce, reflecting on the review of the book and, you know, the significant role the Post has played over generations of American politics, are extremely well made and a great thing for a US Studies Center conversation to be taking note of. Thanks for that. We've covered a lot of ground in terms of questions that people submitted ahead of time, Phil. I'm just sort of reviewing them now, particularly sort of how journalists such as yourself and the Post, perhaps as an institution, are reacting. But there's a lot of questions now about how, if this freneticism we were just talking about a little bit earlier is sort of where a sign of where Trump is now, where he's back against the wall 160 days out, what might it look 45 days out? What might it look like 30 days out? And indeed, what might it look like 3 days after an election? Lawsuits, the dispute in question. I'm wondering if you've got any observations about, based on your observations of Trump to date, how realistic some of the more dire prospects that some of our Australian questioners are sort of putting into their questions about things like that. October surprise, wag the dog, right through to disputing the result and Trump turning his base out, either to disrupt the elections or the certification process or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so that's a great question and a really important topic. I am not in the predictions business, so I'm not going to predict what I think is going to happen, but what I can tell you is based on sort of what we've seen happen before when the president is in these moments of personal crisis, and you know how that informs how this may shake out. And the bottom line is it could be very ugly. Donald Trump is someone who, before taking office and as president, when he's up against a wall and when he feels like he's losing or losing control of a situation, he lashes out, he acts irrationally, he can act dangerously. And I think there's good reason to believe that, you know, if the trend lines in this election continue and he feels the squeeze come fall, that it could become very ugly. And what does ugly mean? Well, ugly could mean, you know, making up conspiracies about Biden, doing sort of the nastiest, most divisive campaigning that we could imagine. But ugly could also mean hurting our democracy and our faith in our democracy in America. And what I mean by that is, you know, casting doubt about the legitimacy of the election, laying the groundwork to challenge the results of the election, refusing, for example, to concede if it is a close result after election day, refusing to you know, do the sort of peaceful transition of power things that we have seen losing presidents do historically through time. I don't know. I have no reporting to indicate that he's decided he's going to act that way, but it would not surprise me based on the way he's acted in past crises. And I think it's very, it's certainly a subject that a lot of Democrats are talking about in the U.S. right now, and it's a pretty frightening prospect for our democracy if that happens.
Yeah. And fair enough about not being in the prediction business. I wise counsel. To lots of
I would get in trouble if I actually predicted what would happen.
Yeah, right. Not your job. Yeah. I want to turn briefly to, you know, we've been talking a lot about U.S. domestic politics. But the way Australia interacts with the United States, of course, is not just as a spectator of its domestic politics, but as an ally, as a country, you know, deeply impacted by American foreign policy. And one thing we at the U.S. Studies Center are tracking extremely closely is the way China as an issue will play a role in this election. The way already the president has attempted to wedge Biden on the issue of China, particularly given painting China as a bad actor with the pandemic raging, serves a number of political purposes there. I just wondering if you could give us some reflections on the state of play on China as an issue at the moment inside Washington, and to the extent to which you're able, we have a sense that there's a fairly robust bipartisan consensus about China as a problem for the United States. But in recent weeks and with the election campaign and China becoming, is that going to come under some pressure that Trump will successfully open up some daylight between Republicans and Democrats on foreign policy towards China?
It's a great question, and it's unclear at this moment sort of how this all evolves, because we're right in the middle of it. As you pointed out, I think if Trump had his wishes, he would create that daylight between his party, or at least his own worldview, and that of the Democrats when it comes to China. The records are not incredibly helpful for him in that regard, just because of, he had done so much of his own outreach to China in the first few years of the presidency, and of course had been working on that trade agreement with China in most recent months before the pandemic. But the pandemic has presented Trump what he seems to think is a pretty good political opportunity to drive a wedge on China. And we're hearing him increasingly talk about the virus originating in China, speculating that there may have been malfeasance on the part of the Chinese on the lab in Wuhan, for example, blaming Chinese officials for not doing more to contain the virus, and suggesting that it never should have reached the shores of the United States the way it had. And he's not taken the leap yet to kind of somehow hold up Biden as responsible for that, but he has made a lot of allusions and comments about Biden as being softer toward China than Trump. And there are some elements of Biden's record in the Obama administration to support that. It was Obama, of course, who did the pivot to Asia and wanted to foster better relations with China, make our sort of Americans' orientation in geopolitics shifted to the east and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we can get into all of that. But there's a lot to play with there for Trump. He's not quite crystallized the message, but he's getting there. And I know his advisors seem to think that this is a winning issue for him. And I suspect we're going to hear a lot more about Biden and China as the summer, takes shape.
And Phil, I can't let our time together go without reminding our listeners that among the many stories you've broken in the Trump White House, it was the so-called Trump Turnbull phone call.
Oh, yes.
Remember that? A long time ago now, it seems, but back in January of 2017, and I certainly remember where I was, as does everybody at the US Study Center at the time. There was the immediate sort of readout from the call, but then a couple of weeks later, you guys broke the story, got hold of the transcript. I'm wondering if you could perhaps, two things I'm really curious about. One is a more general observation for those of us here in Australia. What happened in the 48 hours after your story breaking was remarkable. It was perhaps the best 48 hours Australia has ever had in national media in the United States. There was this rallying from the left to the right and everybody in between about how could you do this to an ally like Australia. And so I guess the first question out there is, just to, you're talking to an Australian audience today, I think, how visible is the alliance relationship that Australia has with the United States inside Washington? I know day to day there's so much coming out of that White House, but just taking you back to that story and perhaps your reflections of its aftermath, did you learn anything about the Australia-US relationship on the basis of that story and perhaps the reaction to it?
I did actually. It's interesting, we hear so much about the American alliance with the UK and with some of the other Western European countries, and that's very natural and so forth. And we all know that Australia is an ally, but there's the story of the phone call between Trump and Malcolm Turnbull, I think, led to days of coverage here in Washington in particular, but all across the US, about what exactly this alliance is with Australia and the extent to which we share intelligence and rely on each other as part of that intelligence alliance, and also the economic ties and trade ties between the US and Australia. Clearly people who work in those fields are well aware of that, but a lot of Americans didn't realize just how close these two countries were. And the ruptured phone call, I think, illustrated for everybody, what the reality is. And, it's worth pointing out too that Trump patched it up with Turnbull, in part, frankly, because Joe Hockey, the ambassador at the time, did a pretty good job of getting to know the Trump administration and sort of figuring out how to navigate that Trump world and find ways to bring them together. I'm forgetting the detail, but there was a Greg Norman role, I believe,
yes,
in bringing Turnbull and Trump back together after the nasty phone call. So anyhow, it seems like everything's fine now, but it was a tenuous beginning for sure.
It was a bit of a shock. I was surprised actually I don't know about you, but the transcript actually read better, to be honest, than some of the readout, and Trump hung up on, I think the call ended abruptly might be a more accurate than Trump hanging up on Turnbull.
Yeah.
The other thing, Phil, it's not that Trump got on that phone call and said, "There's no way I'm doing this." It sounds to me, and I'd be, I know it's a long time ago for you, but
this
on
is
this
the prisoner,
on the refugee detainees deal, Trump knew he had to do it. He was mightily unhappy about it, and he wanted to complain about it long and loud. But at the end of the deal survived, I think is one of the other big takeaways.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that got lost, I think, in the, again, like so many things, in the spectacle and the sheer transgressive nature of the interaction.
It's worth pointing out to that point that so many other world leaders saw the way Trump and Turnbull interacted in that call and the policy outcome, which is that the policy basically stayed the same, and took a lesson away from that, which is, you've just got to let Trump vent sometimes. And, he's not like a normal president. You get on the call, he'll be nasty and acrimonious, let him say his piece, do whatever you have to do. But behind the scenes, you can sort of work it out where there's not actually a policy ramification. I can't tell you how many times Trump has said publicly, I'm gonna, void that trade deal, or I'm gonna sue so-and-so, or he makes threats all the time that he never follows through on. And a lot of foreign leaders figured out very quickly after the Turnbull incident, how to, for lack of a better term, how to manipulate him so that they don't have bad outcomes in their states.
That's a great observation. I think that's spot on. I think, the operative form of words has been, actions, not tweets. But look, we're starting to run short on time. Michael Wadley has been throwing a lot of questions, some of which I've already asked Michael without attribution, and similarly, Bruce Hawker's on with us today, and Phil, Bruce Hawker is a Labour Party political consultant here, and I just want to acknowledge their questions that I asked without attribution, but Michael asked about Pompeo, who actually appeared in Australian media here over the weekend, commenting on the fact that an Australian state government has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, and swung away at that pretty forcefully, and has sort of garnered a lot of media coverage here. But I'm just wondering about, what is Pompeo's game plan? Do you know? I mean, there's been a lot of speculation that he, it seems like the clock is running out if he wanted to flip to a run for a Senate seat. What is do you have any insight about the game plan there?
Well, Mike Pompeo is, he's very smart. He's pretty young, relatively speaking, in politics, and he's very ambitious. He's a bit of an opportunist too. He found out, he was not a Trump supporter to begin with, by the way. He actually spoke out against Trump in support of Marco Rubio at his home state, Kansas, caucuses back in 2016. But after Trump won the election, Pompeo got on the bandwagon right away and saw this as an opportunity for him to advance his own career. He was sort of a backbencher congressman and suddenly became the CIA director. And he figured out how to work with Trump better than almost anybody else in the administration. He knows exactly how to talk to Trump, how to manipulate him to some degree, how to deal with his demands, and ultimately now has become a Secretary of State and arguably the most powerful Secretary of State that we've had in recent times. He is really dictating and driving a lot of the foreign policy of this government. And you know, there were moments, he's a little lower profile right now, but there have been moments where he was almost acting as the defense secretary in addition to the Secretary of State. He, according to my reporting, he aspires to be president himself.
Oh, wow.
And would very much like to run in 2024 or later against President Trump. Not against President Trump, but after Trump leaves office. he along with like a lot of other people, including Vice President Pence and Nikki Haley, the United Nations ambassador. But Pompeo has a long game here politically, and you know, clearly he decided that the Senate was not for him, that he wanted to stay on as the Secretary of State. And if Trump wins a second term, perhaps Pompeo continues, perhaps not. If Trump is defeated, then Pompeo will have time to sort of go into the private sector for a while and build a platform to run for president.
Right. You're very curious about that, and just very curious that the U.S. Secretary of State would do an interview on a cable news outlet here in Australia on a not the typical way we're used to seeing U.S. Secretaries of State.
Also curious, by the way, that the U.S. Secretary of State does travel to Iowa and and all sorts of other American political hotspots. You know, he's got a strategy underway.
Yeah. Hey, this will have to be our last question. It's a good one from Glenn Wrightwick. Pardon me. I think Whitewick. Yes. And Glenn asks, it's been interesting to see Obama become more public in his criticism in the last 2 weeks. What impact do you think this will have? And do we expect to see more engagement from past presidents?
You know, Obama has been really interesting the last couple of weeks, and I expect we're going to see a lot more from him. You know, in the later summer and early fall. He is clearly going to be a surrogate for Joe Biden, and you know, it's worth keeping in mind that as divisive as Obama was as the president, and I shouldn't say divisive, I mean polarizing. As polarizing as he was with the American electorate when he was in office, he is now much more popular. He's the most popular political figure in American politics right now, and he's going to be out there with Biden either on the campaign trail or on Zoom or wherever the campaign trail is electronically during COVID. And I think that's a problem for Trump. And you see that's one of the reasons why Trump keeps bringing up Obama and Obamagate and finding ways to attack Obama, because he's trying to put some chinks in that armor.
Sure. Well, that takes us to the top of the hour. And boy, it does go fast, Phil. I want to thank you so much for your time and putting a coat and tie on a Monday night. But as I said,
this is what I wear at home every day.
It's par for the course for Phil. And again, I do want to echo Bruce's comments. I think the job of day-to-day journalism right now is so important, and unfortunately, the president and his ability to mobilize people and the point of view, the fact that he's making targeting of the media part of his political strategy makes your job that much more difficult, but actually makes the job you do all that much more important. And I thought Bruce's observation on that was absolutely spot on and appropriate. I just want to end by seconding it and thanking you, Phil, for that service you provide and that of your colleagues, but importantly for the hour you've given us tonight in what would I hope it was not too stressful, and that you are well rested for what will be another crazy week in Washington.
Well, Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking with you and enjoyed the questions, and it's just really cool that we're able to do this from half the world away. So thanks to everybody who tuned in, and I really appreciate it.
We'll see you down here one day.
Take care. That'd be great.
Thanks, Phil. Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.